today's mission is to see if I can actually complete one of these videos while in the dancing school lobby. It's quiet here for a minute. Don't know how long it will last. So this is the last honors standard. And since we've covered a lot of parts of the standard, we're just going to do a case study right now on student movements in Latin America and how, in the 1960s, and how it connected to imperialism. And we're not going to get into all of that here. It's going to be for when we discuss it in class. But here's the background information. So first, let's look at the natural resources that Latin America had. And of course, this map is of South America, but I think it gives you the same idea. So Latin America and the Caribbean are home to 25% of the world's forests and 40% of its biodiversity. It's just short of a third of the globe's reserves of copper, bauxite, and silver, has 24% of the oil, 8% of natural gas, and 5% of uranium. So because of these, it's a big area for mining. Now, mining has its effects on the community, especially the indigenous people. They're being disposed of their land, natural resources, and their livelihoods. Industrial runoff, like you see here, affects local water sources. So, not good. It leads to displacement of the people. It undermines their traditional economies, even often destroys large parts of their traditional cultures, and destroys the local ecosystems for them, for plants, for animals, so on and so forth. Okay, so this imperialism and the resources needed for the Industrial Revolution is not just things of the past. These trends exist today, just in different forms. So right now, you can call this exploring developing countries. We know they're there, we know they exist, but continue to explore what resources are there. So this shows you just how much they've invested in developing countries as opposed to other ones. So you see a high of 67% in 1997, but then there was a worldwide depression, it decreased, but as of 2001, it's still 58%. I'm not sure what the current number is. If anyone finds it before me, shoot me a message or comment below, as they say. So of the top 10 individual country recipients of global exploration investment, and of those top 10, it counts for 69% of the world's overall exploration budget total. And yet 5 of them are Latin America. So they're by far the leading region for mining projects, with an investment of more than $45 million in a number of major mineral and metal categories as of 15 years ago, in January 2003. So how does the governments of these countries respond to this? Some might call it uninvolvement. Resource rich, say that 3 times fast, countries like Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia have adopted mining codes that unambiguously favor foreign corporations over the indigenous people, the environment, and labor rights. So putting the cash first, right? So now let's transition from the resources available there now a few decades to the 1960s, when we, because right now we're talking about student activism post-Parkland, and we've compared it to other student movements like the teenagers, the college students at the Woolworth lunch counters, and also the U.S. students protesting Vietnam. Well, they weren't just protesting the United States. Students in Latin America were protesting a lot in the 1960s as well. So what was happening in Latin America at this time? You have their population expanding. There was low education being provided for the people there. The expectancy of life was low. The working conditions were poor. There's a very small middle class. All sorts of things. Low per capita income and GNP. Low development of agricultural and fishing resources. Low consumption of mechanical and industrial energy. All this sort of stuff, right? A lot of this is the result of imperialism that we discussed. We discussed the advantages and disadvantages. Well, these are a lot of the disadvantages. So you have these situations. What are people going to do about it? Many students were protesting various things, political parties, all sorts of stuff. I know if you were in my class today, which is Wednesday, we discussed the Brazilian student who, in the 1960s, who was killed when he was protesting that low-income students couldn't afford the meals that they were eating. Well, in 1960, 17 million students in this area were in the higher education age group. Shouldn't be a question mark there. Um, Only 500,000 of them were studying in universities. So that percentage-wise is much smaller than you see like the United States. Because, however, a larger percentage of them were politically active. In the US, 5% of students actively involved in political protest in the 60s. We always think that number is so much higher. Um, but in Colombia, the number was 26%, Puerto Rico, 42%, 43% in Panama, 26% in Mexico. And what you're going to see the next couple of slides are actually pictures from a Mexican movement in 1968, largely made by students protesting the government at the time and trying to ramp up attention right before the 1968 Olympics, which were being held there. How did socioeconomics affect those who were protesting there? In Colombia, the largest percent of highly involved political protesting students are from the lower classes, 38% to 28%. So, what does that show you? In Puerto Rico, the numbers were different. 44% are from upper classes and 36% from lower classes. If you figure the middle class in Mexico, it's almost evenly distributed. Also, in all these countries, the numbers went up if you figure students who lived with their families versus students who didn't live with their families. Those students who didn't live with their families and lived in a dorm or apartment were more likely to be politically involved and active in protests at the time. Their schooling figured as well. Most of the students who were highly involved came from public schools. Next would be religious schools. Private schools were on the bottom. Their majors mattered. If you were in the humanities or social sciences, you were more likely to be involved with these protests than students involved with the sciences. Sort of makes sense, right? You can look at some of the statistics there. Puerto Rico, 71% of law students were highly involved, but only 28% in the sciences. 61% of law students from Colombia. What about happiness? Also, it seemed that students that reported being unhappy were more likely to protest than students that did claim to be happy. I guess that makes sense, right? So, what about happiness? Their political positions, whether they're left or right leaning. Students who are left leaning were more likely to be politically active in protests. Um, you see that more in Puerto Rico, 67% to 33% who consider themselves to the right politically. Religious leanings also, they tended to be not religious as compared to religious. Now, I know you can't see the Mexico number there, can you? I have this in a chart. Let me consult it. Here we go. Mexico, very religious. As you see, there was 33%. Not religious was 45%. Were these protests similar to the ones in America? They're actually more similar to other protests in undeveloped areas such as Asia and Africa. You have to consider their tactics, the types of protests. Some ways they were similar, but often in ways they were different. They would do things that were quick and inexpensive, paint graffiti on walls, or in this case, you see on a bus for the Mexico 68 protest. Also, more guerrilla warfare and more military tactics involved. Many believed that social change would not happen without the use of such tactics. So what we need to discuss are what are their connections? How is the fact that Latin America has all these natural resources? How do these protests in the 60s relate to imperialism? How does it relate to the contemporary issues, such as issues with the environment or student activism today? That's what we're going to talk about in class. If you have any questions, let me know. Before we go, I just want to tell you the two sources. I got this stuff from the student information was from Student Opposition in Latin America by Orlando Albornoz. That was published in November of 1966, so actually before the Mexican protests, but when other protests were in full swing. And the one on resources was from Imperialism and Resistance, Canadian Mining Companies in Latin America by Todd Gordon and Jeffrey Weber from 2008. Go ahead and read the rest of it if you wish. It is on JSTOR, which you can use Morris Tech and Devils with. All right, see you soon.